The train rocked gently as it rattled westward across the vast open plains, its iron wheels singing against the tracks. Clara sat by the window, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes watching the blur of prairie grass and endless sky. Every mile carried her farther from the small eastern town she had once called home, and deeper into the unknown world she had promised to enter. She wasn't running away. Not exactly, but she also wasn't leaving behind much worth holding on to. Orphaned young and raised by distant relatives who saw her more as a burden than family, Clara had grown up with little kindness and even less love. At 22, she had worked as a seamstress in a crowded boarding house, saving pennies from long days of stitching until she finally admitted a hard truth to herself. No one in her hometown would ever choose her. Men passed her by, uninterested in a plain woman with little dowry and no family connections. So when she saw the newspaper advertisement, young rancher seeks respectable lady for marriage, widow or orphan acceptable, must be of steady disposition and God-fearing character, Clara's heart had leaped. The idea seemed daring, almost desperate, but also like her only chance. She answered the ad with trembling hands, pouring her heart into the letter. Weeks later, a reply came. The rancher's name was Thomas Hale, a man who lived far in the Western Territories. His words were brief, almost formal, but they held a promise of something Clara longed for: stability. He did not speak of love, only of companionship, and of needing someone who could help raise his young daughter. Clara told herself it was enough. Now, seated on the train, with a small trunk at her feet holding all she owned in the world, Clara felt a storm of emotions twisting inside her. Hope, fear, and doubt tangled together until her chest ached. She smoothed the skirt of her traveling dress and whispered to herself, "This is your chance, your only chance." Around her, other passengers chatted and laughed, merchants, families, prospectors chasing dreams of fortune. Clara felt alone among them, an outsider marked by her secret. No one could guess that she was a mail-order bride, a woman so unwanted in her own town that she had to cross half the country to find a husband. As the train slowed to stop at a dusty little station, Clara caught her reflection in the window. The face looking back at her was pale, her blue eyes wide with both worry and determination. She pinned her straw bonnet more firmly under her chin, lifted her chin and forced herself to breathe. When the train hissed to a halt, Clara stepped down onto the wooden platform. Heat rolled off the sun-baked earth, the air dry and sharp. Dust clung to her hem almost immediately. She scanned the small crowd gathered at the station, men in wide-brimmed hats, women in calico dresses, children darting about like wild colts. Her heart hammered as she searched for the man who had written her. She imagined him taller, broad-shouldered from work on the land, perhaps kind but serious, a man who had known both hardship and responsibility. Yet, as her eyes scanned each face, no one stepped forward to greet her. For a moment, Clara's breath caught. What if he had changed his mind? What if Thomas Hale no longer wanted her? She felt the old familiar sting of rejection pressing at the back of her eyes. Then, at the far edge of the platform, she saw him. A man stood with a little girl at his side, his hat pulled low, his stance stiff. The child clung to his hand, half hiding behind his leg. Clara's gaze locked onto them, her heart lurching. She didn't yet know that this girl, small, silent, watchful, would one day change everything with a whispered question. But at that moment, all Clara could think was, does he already regret sending for me? The journey had brought her here, across hundreds of miles, into the promise of a new life. Yet, as she stood at the edge of her future, Clara could not shake the fear that she was still unwanted. Clara's feet felt heavy as she stepped off the wooden platform, the heat of the western sun already pressing against her back. With each step toward the man and child, her courage thinned, until it felt like she was walking into judgment rather than a new life. The man to Miss Hale stood as still as a fence post, his hat shading most of his face. Only his jaw was visible, firm, and unsmiling. He did not move forward to greet her, nor did he tip his hat in courtesy. Instead, he regarded her with an unreadable expression, as though trying to decide whether she was a mistake. Beside him, the little girl clung tighter to his hand. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, with pale hair that the sun had kissed into golden streaks. Her wide brown eyes studied Clara, not with curiosity, but with suspicion, like a colt wary of strangers. Clara smoothed her skirt and tried to smile, though her lips felt stiff. She gave a small nod. "Mr. Hale." Her voice trembled, betraying both nerves and hope. Thomas inclined his head slightly. "Miss Clara," he replied, his tone clipped, polite but distant. His voice was deep, carrying a roughness that matched the land itself. For a moment, Clara waited for some warmth, some reassurance. None came. Instead, Thomas shifted his weight, glancing briefly at the child before looking back at her. "This is Emily," he said. "My daughter." The little girl ducked her head, half hiding behind her father's leg, and Clara's heart ached at the sight. She bent slightly, lowering her voice to a softer tone meant to comfort. "Hello, Emily, I'm very pleased to meet you." Emily didn't answer. She only pressed closer to her father's side, her tiny fingers gripping his coat with silent desperation. Clara's smile faltered, but she straightened quickly. folding her hands at her waist to still their tremor. She reminded herself that children needed time to warm to strangers. It wasn't rejection, just caution. Still, the sting of being avoided so quickly pierced deeper than she cared to admit. Thomas cleared his throat. "We've got a wagon waiting." His words were blunt, brisk, as if there were no room for pleasantries. He picked up Clara's trunk without asking if she needed help, hefting it as though it were no heavier than a sack of grain, then strode toward the wagon. Clara and Emily followed, their footsteps awkwardly out of sync. The wagon ride stretched out in silence. Clara sat stiffly on the wooden seat, the jolts of the wheels rattling her bones. Dust rose in soft clouds with every turn of the wheel, coating her gloves and bonnet. She tried several times to spark conversation, commenting on the wide open land, the distant mountains, the clear sky, but each time Thomas answered with only a word or two, if at all. His tone was courteous but hollow, as though he spoke from obligation rather than interest. Emily sat pressed against her father's side, her gaze flicking once toward Clara, then darting away like a startled bird. Clara folded her hands tighter in her lap, fighting the growing heaviness in her chest. When the ranch came into view, it rose out of the land like a fortress of solitude, wide fields stretching into the horizon, a sturdy barn standing sentinel, and a white-painted house with a porch that faced the setting sun. It was beautiful in its ruggedness, yet Clara couldn't ignore how empty it felt. No flowers softened the yard, no children's toys lay scattered. It was a place built for survival, not for joy. Thomas helped Emily down first, then reached for Clara's hand as she stepped from the wagon. His grip was strong, steady, but as soon as her feet touched the ground, he let go quickly, as though the contact had been more duty than choice. He led her up the porch steps and opened the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. The furniture was plain but well made, every corner neat and orderly. Yet the silence in the house was heavy, as if laughter had once lived here but had long since fled. Thomas set her trunk down with a dull thud in the entryway. "You'll be in the spare room," he said. "I'll show you where." Clara followed him down a narrow hall, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She had a roof, a home, perhaps even a future. But the man who had summoned her here, her supposed husband to be, treated her like a guest, not a bride. When he opened the small room for her, Clara forced another smile. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." He nodded once. "It's Thomas." Then, without another word, he left her standing in the doorway, alone with her trunk and her aching uncertainty. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. She had traveled hundreds of miles to this place, believing she might finally belong. Yet tonight, in this silent house, she wondered if she had only traded one loneliness for another, and in her heart, a whisper began to echo, "Perhaps I am unwanted here too." The following morning, Clara awoke early, her body still stiff from the long train ride and restless sleep in an unfamiliar bed. Sunlight spilled through the small window of the spare room, casting golden stripes across the quilt. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the quiet creaks of the house. She could hear Thomas moving about in the kitchen, the soft clink of tin cups, and the scrape of a chair across the floor. When she stepped out, Emily was already seated at the table, her chin barely clearing the edge. The little girl's eyes flickered to Clara and then quickly dropped to her plate, as if caught in a secret she wasn't ready to share. Thomas offered Clara no smile of greeting, only a curt nod as he set a plate before her. "Town's about 5 miles east," he said as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "We go once a week for supplies. We'll head there today. Best you're seen sooner than later." The words were practical, but Clara heard the unspoken truth beneath them. People would talk, and it was better to face the whispers head-on. She nodded, though her stomach knotted. Being paraded before strangers, introduced as the bride Thomas had sent for it, made her heart pound with dread. The ride into town was quiet, just as the day before. Thomas kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his jaw set like stone. Emily sat between them, small hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara wanted to reach out, to bridge the silence. But something about Thomas's presence pressed her into restraint. When they finally reached the town, a scatter of weather-worn buildings gathered around a dusty main street. Heads turned almost immediately. Women paused in their errands, men straightened from hitching their horses, and children stopped mid-play. Clara felt the weight of every eye, as if it pressed down on her shoulders. She heard the whispers begin before they even reached the general store. "That's Hertha, mail-order bride. Poor thing, look at her plain as day. Wonder how long she lasts out there with him." Clara kept her chin high, though her cheeks burned hot. She had endured stares before, back home where people pitied her for her orphaned past, but here, the whispers were sharper, laced with judgment. She wasn't simply an outsider. She was an arrangement, a bargain struck on paper. A woman who had traveled across the country for the promise of a name and roof. Inside the general store, the air was thick with scrutiny. The shopkeeper's wife, a round woman with sharp eyes, studied Clara from head to toe, her lips pursing into a thin line. She greeted Thomas with polite words, but gave Clara a smile that felt brittle. like porcelain ready to crack. Clara helped gather supplies, stacking flour, beans, and coffee tins neatly on the counter, but the woman's gaze never left her. At one point, Clara overheard her mutter to another customer, "Not much to look at. Guess he just needed someone to mind the girl." Her heart sank, but she pressed her lips together and said nothing. To show hurt would only prove them right that she was fragile, unfit for the harshness of this place. When they stepped back out into the sun, Clara noticed another group of women across the street. Their voices lowered but their glances sharp. One leaned close to the other, whispering with a laugh that carried just enough for Clara to hear. She never filled the shoes of his first wife. The words hit Clara harder than any of the others. His first wife, of course, the silence in his house, the sadness in Emily's eyes, the guarded distance in Thomas's manner, it all made sense now. She was not only a stranger, she was a shadow cast against the memory of the woman he had loved and lost. As they rode back to the ranch, Clara sat with her hands tightly folded, her chest aching. She dared a glance at Emily, who sat quietly beside her father. The child's eyes, when they met hers for the briefest moment, were solemn and searching, as though weighing whether this new woman could ever belong. Clara looked away quickly, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. She had come here believing she might find a place where she was wanted, yet the whispers in town had planted a cruel doubt. Perhaps she was nothing more than a placeholder, an outsider meant to fill chores and duties, but never a heart. The wagon wheels creaked beneath them, the road stretching endlessly back to the ranch. Clara sat in silence, feeling the whispers cling to her like burrs, sharp and unshakable. That night, as she unpacked her few belongings in the small spare room, she paused with a worn handkerchief pressed between her fingers. She whispered to the empty walls, "Am I only here because no one else would be?" The quiet house gave no answer. But outside, in the small bedroom at the end of the hall, a little girl lay awake, listening, wondering if the woman who had come into her life would stay or if she, too, would disappear like her mother had. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Clara tried to settle into life on the ranch, helping with meals, sweeping the porch, mending clothes, but every task felt heavy beneath the unspoken tension in the house. Thomas kept to his work in the fields and barns, speaking to her only when necessary. Emily, the little girl who would one day shape Clara's heart, kept herself hidden in shadows and silence. At first, Clara thought it was simply shyness. Children could be slow to trust, especially with a stranger suddenly living in their home. But soon, she began to notice the depth of Emily's distance. The child rarely spoke, and when she did, it was only to her father. Her words quiet and clipped on. She would sit at the table for meals with her head bowed, never lifting her gaze toward Clara. If Clara tried to ask a gentle question, "Would you like some more potatoes, Emily? Or did you have fun outside today?" the child would shrink back, answering with the smallest shake of her head, or none at all. One afternoon, Clara stepped into the yard and found Emily sitting beneath the large oak tree near the house. The girl held a small doll in her lap, its dress worn thin, its yarn hair tangled. Clara paused, watching the child hum softly to herself, rocking the doll back and forth as though it were alive. It was the first glimpse of tenderness she had seen in the girl, and her heart ached at the sight. Clara walked slowly closer, her steps light so as not to startle her. "That's a very pretty doll," she said softly. Emily froze, her little arms tightening around the toy. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, without a word, she scrambled to her feet and ran back toward the house, her doll clutched tightly to her chest. Clara stood there alone, the rejection sinking into her like cold water. She wasn't angry, how could she be? The girl had lost her mother not long ago. Clara knew grief carved deep wounds, wounds that made it hard to open one's heart. But still, the sting of being pushed away cut deep. That night, as Clara prepared to set the table for supper, she noticed Emily sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the fading sunset. The girl's shoulders slumped, her small frame weighed down by something far too heavy for her age. Clara hesitated, then carried a folded quilt outside. Without a word, she draped it gently over Emily's shoulders. The child flinched at the touch but didn't run. Clara sat beside her, keeping her hands folded in her lap, giving the girl space. They watched the horizon together in silence, the air cooling as the sky deepened into shades of rose and violet. At last, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sunset is beautiful, isn't it? Your mama must have loved it here." Emily's small fingers gripped the edge of the quilt. For a long time, Clara thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a quiet, trembling voice, the girl whispered, She said the sky was God painting." Clara's throat tightened, and she swallowed hard against the lump rising there. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, her heart aching for the child's loss. "She sounds like she was very wise," Clara said gently. Emily didn't reply, but she didn't pull away either. For Clara, it was a fragile step forward, a thread of connection, where before there had been none. Later that evening, long after Emily had gone to bed, Clara heard muffled sounds drifting down the hallway. She followed the faint sobs to the child's small room. The door was cracked open, and through it, Clara saw Emily curled up on her bed, clutching the doll tight against her chest, her tiny shoulders shaking with quiet cries. Clara's heart broke. She wanted nothing more than to rush in, to gather the little girl in her arms, to promise her she would never be left alone again. But she hesitated, her hand hovering near the doorframe. Would her presence comfort Emily, or would it only drive her further away? She leaned against the wall, listening, tears welling in her own eyes. In that moment, she understood something vital. Emily's silence wasn't shyness. It was pain. Deep, aching pain from a wound too fresh for words. Clara pressed her palm against her chest, whispering into the quiet hall, "Oh child, I know what it is to feel forgotten." From then on, Clara carried a quiet determination. She would not force her way into Emily's heart, but she would wait. She would be there in every meal cooked, every quilt mended, every moment of stillness shared until the girl no longer felt alone in her grief. For Clara herself had once been a lonely child longing for comfort, and now, faced with a little girl's pain, she vowed she would not repeat the cycle of abandonment. Somehow, someday, she would earn Emily's trust. The nights at the Hale Ranch were quiet, broken only by the rustle of wind through the trees and the distant call of a night bird. Clara often lay awake in her small room, the stillness pressing down like a weight she had grown accustomed to. The hush of her boarding house back east, but this silence was different. It was not filled with the soft comfort of others nearby, but with the reminder that she was a stranger in a house that did not yet feel like hers. It was on one such night, when the wind rattled loose shutters and the fire in the hearth burned low, that Clara first stumbled upon the connection she had been longing for. She had risen to fetch a quilt from the parlor, padding softly through the darkened hallway in her stocking feet. As she passed the sitting room, she caught a faint hiccuping sob, muffled as if swallowed down by a small throat. Clara's breath caught. She followed the sound and found Emily curled on the rug by the fireplace, her small frame trembling as tears streaked her cheeks. The doll lay beside her, forgotten, while she buried her face in her hands. The sight pierced Clara's heart so deeply she felt her own chest ache. For a moment she hesitated, unsure if approaching would only frighten the girl further. But then she remembered her own lonely childhood nights, when she had cried in silence, longing for arms that never came. Clara would not repeat that cruelty. Quietly, she crossed the room and lowered herself to the floor, leaving a careful distance so Emily would not feel trapped. "Emily," she whispered softly, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" The girl sniffled, glancing up with red-rimmed eyes, startled to see Clara there. She quickly swiped her tears with her sleeve, as if ashamed of them, and shook her head. Clara offered a faint smile, not pressing. Instead, she began to hum. The tune was one her own mother had once sung before sickness carried her away, a lullaby. So old Clara barely remembered the words, but the melody remained etched in her heart. Soft and steady, the sound filled the quiet room like a tender blanket. Emily's crying slowed. Her small hands lowered, and her wide eyes blinked at Clara in surprise. After a long silence, she whispered hoarsely, "My mama used to sing." Clara's breaths caught, but she kept her smile steady. "I believe she must have had a lovely voice," she said softly. Emily nodded, her chin trembling. Then, to Clara's astonishment, the child scooted a little closer, her small body drawn by the comfort she hadn't allowed herself to seek before. Clara resisted the urge to gather her up immediately. Instead, she laid her hands in her lap and kept humming, letting the child set the pace. At last, Emily leaned against her, a tentative touch, light as a feather. Clara's heart swelled so suddenly she feared it might break. She shifted slightly, wrapping an arm carefully around the girl's small shoulders. Emily did not pull away. Instead, she sagged into the embrace, her tears beginning anew, but this time they were quieter, freer, as though at last she had found a safe place to let them fall. Clara held her close, rocking her gently as the lullaby faded into silence. She whispered soothing words, nothing more than murmurs, but they seemed to ease the child's sobs. Minutes passed, and eventually Emily's breathing slowed, her eyelids drooping with the exhaustion of grief. When she finally spoke again, her voice was so small, Clara almost missed it. "Can you stay?" Clara's throat tightened. She kissed the top of the girl's head softly. "Yes, sweetheart. I'll stay as long as you want me to." That night, Clara remained by the fireplace, the child curled in her lap, fast asleep. The fire burned low, but Clara felt a warmth that no flame could match. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, she did not feel like an intruder. She felt like she had a place, maybe not with Thomas yet, but with Emily, who needed her in a way no one ever had before. When Thomas rose early the next morning and found them still on the rug, his daughter nestled safely against the woman he had doubted, he paused in the doorway, his stern expression flickering into something softer. But he said nothing, only turned quietly away, leaving them as they were. For Clara, it was the beginning of something fragile but beautiful, a bridge of trust, built not by obligation, but by love. She did not know yet that a whispered question would soon change everything, but she knew this: she was no longer invisible. Emily had let her in, and that alone was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she belonged. The days after that night by the fireplace brought a small but unmistakable change. Emily no longer vanished the moment Clara entered her room. She still clung close to her father and kept her words guarded. But every now and then, her wide brown eyes sought Clara's face, curious, cautious, as if testing the strength of the invisible thread that had begun to bind them together. Clara did not rush her. She knew trust was a tender seed, one that needed patience, warmth, and quiet care. She continued humming lullabies while mending clothes, left little wildflowers tucked into Emily's doll's lap, and sat beside her at supper without demanding conversation. Each gesture was small, but each one seemed to chip away at the wall surrounding the child's heart. One afternoon, Clara found Emily outside by the barn, crouched in the dirt with a row of smooth stones lined up carefully before her. The little girl was humming faintly, her lips pursed in concentration as she sorted them by size. Clara paused a few steps away. "That's a fine collection," she said gently. Emily glanced up, and for the first time, she didn't look away immediately. "They're soldiers," she whispered, her voice raspy with disuse. Clara's lips curved into a smile. "Soldiers, are they? Then, I suppose they must need a general to lead them." Emily blinked at her, startled, then bit her lip to hide a smile. She didn't speak again, but she pushed one of the stones closer to Clara's side, as if offering a place in her little army. Clara's heart leaped at the small invitation, and she sat in the dirt beside her without hesitation. That evening, after supper, the skies opened with a summer storm. Rain lashed the windows, the wind howled against the shutters, and thunder rolled across the plains. Clara busied herself in the kitchen, tidying dishes. When she heard a small cry from down the hall, she hurried to Emily's room and found the child curled under her quilt, her doll clasped tight in her arms, her small body shaking each time thunder boomed. Clara's chest tightened. Without a word, she crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Storms can be frightening," she whispered, stroking the quilt near Emily's shoulder. "But they pass quickly, and they can't hurt us in here." Emily peeked out from beneath the covers, her eyes wide and wet. "I don't like them," she admitted in a trembling voice. Clara reached out, brushing a damp curl from her forehead. "I didn't like them either when I was a girl, but I used to pretend the thunder was angels moving furniture in heaven. That way, it didn't seem so scary." Emily let out a small hiccup of a laugh, fragile but real. She shifted, sliding a little closer. Clara opened her arms, hesitating only long enough to see if the girl would accept. Emily did. She nestled against Clara's chest, the trust so sudden and complete it nearly undid her. Clara held her close, rocking gently, murmuring soft words of comfort. The storm raged outside, but within the small room there was only warmth, the steady beat of Clara's heart against the child's ear. It was then that Emily whispered, it so faintly Clara almost thought she had imagined it. "Can you be my mama?" The words pierced her like a blade, sharp and sweet all at once. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Tears burned behind her eyes as she pressed her cheek against the top of Emily's head. "Oh, darling," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you'll have me, I would be honored to be your mama." Emily's small arms tightened around her neck, her little body clinging with all the desperation of a child who had lost too much too soon. And in that embrace, Clara felt something she had never known before, the indescribable weight and beauty of being needed, of being chosen by a child's fragile heart. The storm began to quiet, the thunder rolling further away, but neither stirred. Clara wept silently into Emily's hair, not out of sorrow but from the overwhelming swell of love and belonging. She had thought she would never know. When at last Emily drifted to sleep in her arms, Clara laid her gently back against the pillow and tucked the quilt around her shoulders. She lingered there, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. As she rose to leave, Clara caught sight of Thomas standing in the doorway. His expression was shadowed, unreadable, but his eyes lingered on the sight of his daughter asleep, peace finally softening her little face. For the briefest moment, something flickered in his gaze when it met Clara's, something that looked very much like gratitude. Clara slipped past him quietly, her heart still trembling with the words she had just heard. "Can you be my mama?" For so long, she had believed she was unwanted, unworthy of such a title. Yet tonight, in the middle of a storm, a little girl had asked the question that changed everything, and Clara knew she could never, ever walk away. The storm that had shaken the house the night before seemed to leave something behind, something unseen, but deeply felt. Clara moved about the ranch with a lighter step, though she carried the memory of Emily's whispered words like a fragile jewel tucked against her heart. "Mama," the sound echoed inside her, warming every corner of the emptiness she had once felt. But it wasn't only Clara who noticed the change. Thomas, though quiet as ever, found his eyes drawn to her more often. He had lingered at the bedroom doorway long enough the night before to see the way Emily curled trustingly into Clara's arms, and he couldn't shake the image from his mind. For months his daughter had resisted every attempt at comfort, every kind word from neighbors, every well-meaning gesture. Yet with Clara, she had yielded, softened, even smiled. It stirred something in him. though he would not yet name it. The following morning, Clara rose early to fetch water. When she returned, she found Emily already dressed, her small hands tugging clumsily at her hair ribbon. Clara knelt behind her and tied it neatly into a bow. Emily turned her head slightly, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas, standing near the table, noticed his brow furrowed, not in disapproval but in a kind of wary amazement. He cleared his throat. "Emily, go fetch the eggs for breakfast." The girl scampered out the door. Clara rose, brushing her hands against her apron, and turned toward him. "She's a sweet child," she said softly. Thomas hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "She hasn't smiled like that in a long while." Clara lowered her gaze, unsure whether to take his words as a reproach or a rare gift of honesty. Grief weighs heavy on children, perhaps heavier than on us grown folk, but she carries her mother's memory with such love. All she needs is someone to share that love with. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost grudgingly, he muttered, "She seems to think you're fit for that." Clara's breath caught. The words were rough, unpolished, but they weren't dismissive. They were an acknowledgement. She swallowed the swell of emotion rising in her throat and only nodded. That week, Clara began helping more around the ranch. She rose before dawn, kneading bread while the rooster crowed, and joined Emily in feeding the hens. Later, when Thomas worked the fields, she brought him cool water and stood beside him as he repaired fences. He rarely spoke more than a few words, but she noticed his glances quick, guarded, as though he were trying to puzzle out who she truly was. One evening, the three of them sat by the fire, Emily curled against Clara's side, drifting toward sleep as Clara hummed a lullaby. Thomas sat across from them, his eyes fixed on the flames, but Clara felt the weight of his attention. When the song ended, silence filled the room, heavy yet not uncomfortable. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas spoke. "She asked you to be her mama, didn't she?" Clara's head snapped up, startled. His gaze was steady, his voice quiet but certain. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she did." Thomas's expression shifted, something raw flickering in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or longing. She hasn't called anyone that since." His voice broke, and he turned away, pressing a hand over his mouth. Clara's heart ached. She wanted to reach for him, to bridge the distance his grief had carved, but she held still. Instead, she spoke gently, her voice carrying both strength and tenderness. "I would never try to replace her mother. I know the love they shared can't be touched, but I will care for her, with all that I am, if you'll allow me." His shoulders stiffened, then slowly relaxed. He didn't answer, but his silence was no longer cold. It felt like a door left, slightly ajar. The next day proved the change even more clearly. As Clara and Emily worked together in the kitchen, Emily laughed at something Clara said, a soft, tinkling sound that filled the room. Thomas walked in at that moment, and he froze. In the doorway, the sight of his daughter, her eyes bright, her cheeks flushed with joy, seemed to steal his breath. He looked at Clara then, really looked at her, and for the first time, gratitude softened his gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. It wasn't much, but for Clara, it was everything. The walls that had once loomed high and unyielding around this man and his daughter were beginning to crumble. Slowly, cautiously, brick by brick, they were letting her in, and Clara, who had once believed herself unwanted, began to hope tentatively. Like a seed stretching toward the sun, that perhaps she could belong here, not as a stranger, but as part of a family. The sun rose pale and uncertain behind a curtain of dark clouds. From the moment Clara stepped outside that morning, she felt the unease in the air. The wind carried a sharp bite, tossing her hair into her eyes as she hurried to gather the chickens into their coop. Even the animals sensed it, the horses restless in the barn, the cows shifting uneasily in the pasture. By midday, the storm broke. Rain poured from the sky in relentless sheets, drumming against the roof and turning the ranch yard into a river of mud. Thunder rolled across the valley, and each strike of lightning lit up the horizon with a white, merciless flash. Inside, Emily clung to Clara, her small fingers gripping tightly at her skirt. Clara soothed her as best she could, humming softly and holding her close, even while her own heart raced with fear. She had weathered storms back east, but here, where the land stretched wide and wild, the fury of the skies felt greater, like something alive and dangerous. Thomas burst through the door, drenched from head to toe. "The south fence is down," he said grimly, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "If the cattle get out, we'll lose half the herd." Clara's heart tightened. He needed help. She knew it, but she also saw the way Emily trembled, refusing to let go of her hand, torn between the child's fear and the rancher's burden. She made a swift decision. "Emily," Clara whispered, crouching so her eyes were level with the girl's, "you'll be safe here by the fire. Mama will be right back." The word slipped from her lips before she realized it, and Emily's eyes widened. For a moment, Clara feared she had said too much, but then Emily nodded, as though the word carried a promise she desperately wanted to believe. Clara tied a shawl tightly around her shoulders and rushed after Thomas into the storm. Rain pelted, her face soaking her dress until it clung to her skin. The earth sucked at her boots as she followed him across the muddy yard and into the field, where the fence had collapsed beneath the weight of the wind. Thomas glanced back, his eyes widening. "What are you doing out here? Get back inside. I won't leave you to fight this alone," Clara shouted above the roar of the wind. There was no time to argue. Together, they wrestled with the heavy wooden rails, setting them upright and hammering them back into place. Clara's hands blistered. Her arms ached, but she did not falter. Each time Thomas thought she would collapse, she gritted her teeth and lifted again, her determination as fierce as the storm itself. At one point, a rail slipped, nearly striking her leg. Thomas caught it just in time, his hand brushing hers. As he steadied it, for a fleeting second, their eyes met through the rain, his filled with surprise, hers with resolve. Without words, he understood. She wasn't just a visitor here. She was fighting for this place, for Emily, for him. Hours seemed to pass before the storm finally began to ease. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, and the fence stood repaired. Exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, Thomas and Clara staggered back toward the house. Inside, Emily ran to them, throwing her arms around Clara's waist first, then clinging to her father's leg. Tears streaked the child's cheeks. "I was so scared," Emily whispered. Clara knelt, pulling the girl into her arms. "I know, darling, but look, we're safe, all of us. The storm has passed." Thomas stood silently, watching them. His gaze lingered on Clara, the mud smeared across her face, the blistered hands, the damp strands of hair plastered to her cheeks. She should have looked worn, bedraggled. Instead, to him, she looked radiant, stronger and braver than he had ever imagined. "Clara," he said softly, almost reverently. She looked up at him, and something unspoken passed between them. Respect, gratitude, and something deeper, just beginning to bloom. That night, when Emily was finally asleep, Thomas lingered by the fire with Clara. The crackle of the flames filled the silence between them until he finally spoke. "You didn't have to help me today," he said quietly. "Most would have stayed inside." Clara met his gaze, her voice steady. "This is my home too. If I'm to belong here, I'll face whatever trials come with it." His chest tightened at her words. He wanted to argue, to remind her that she had come here as a bride he hadn't been ready to welcome. But the truth was undeniable. She had proven her place not by words, but by action. For the first time since his wife's passing, Thomas felt the stirrings of hope, not just for himself, but for his daughter, for the ranch, for the future. And Clara, sitting beside him with firelight flickering in her eyes, felt the same. The days following the storm brought an unusual peace to the ranch. The fence held strong, the cattle remained safe, and the skies turned a clear, hopeful blue. Yet it wasn't just the land that felt renewed. Something had shifted within the walls of Thomas's home. Clara noticed it first in small ways. Thomas no longer avoided her presence at the dinner table. Instead, he sat across from her, listening quietly as she and Emily spoke. His silence no longer felt like dismissal, it carried weight, thought, and a strange warmth she hadn't seen before. Emily, too, seemed lighter. She followed Clara like a shadow, eager to help with chores, her laughter echoing through the halls, in a way that made the once solemn house feel alive again. Each time Clara saw the girl smile, her heart ached with both tenderness and fear. Tenderness because Emily filled her with a love she had never known. Fear because she wondered if, at any moment, Thomas might still send her away. But Thomas was watching. More than either of them realized. One afternoon, as Clara and Emily sat beneath the cottonwood tree near the barn, Thomas stood at a distance, hammer in hand, pretending to mend a gate. In truth, he could not take his eyes off the sight before him. Clara's voice carried gently on the breeze as she braided Emily's hair, humming softly. The girl leaned against her, utterly at peace. The image pierced him. For months after his wife's death, he had been certain no woman could ever step into that role again. His late wife's memory clung to him like a shadow, and guilt gnawed at him whenever he imagined moving on. But seeing Clara and Emily together, he realized it wasn't about replacing the past. It was about building a future. He clenched the hammer tighter, his chest tightening. He had brought Clara here with reluctance, thinking only of duty. But, somewhere along the way, his heart had begun to awaken. That evening, Clara prepared stew while Emily set the table, humming the very tune Clara had taught her. When Thomas entered the kitchen, he paused in the doorway, watching the two of them. It felt so natural, so right. "Dinner's ready," Clara said softly, her cheeks flushing when she noticed his gaze linger. They ate together in quiet harmony, and when Emily excused herself to fetch a book, Thomas finally spoke. "You've done more for her in a few weeks than I've managed in months," he admitted, his voice low, almost raw. "She laughs again, because of you." Clara lowered her spoon, her hands trembling slightly. She only needed someone to listen, someone to love her. "And you've given her that," he said firmly. Clara's eyes lifted to his, searching for the meaning behind his words. "And what of you, Thomas? Do you still wish I hadn't come?" The question hung in the air, heavy and vulnerable. He exhaled slowly, setting his spoon down. When I wrote that letter, I thought I was just filling a need. Someone to care for Emily. To keep the house in order. I wasn't ready to open my heart. I told myself I couldn't. But after the storm, after seeing what you've given us, his voice broke slightly. I realized I was blind. Her breath caught. She had longed for even the smallest sign, that he saw her, that she wasn't just a burden. Now, here he was, his heart laid bare in words he never thought he'd speak. Later that night, when the house was quiet, Thomas found Clara on the porch. The moon cast a silver glow over the ranch, and the crickets sang softly in the grass. "You're strong," he said, stepping beside her, "stronger than I ever expected. And I'd be a fool not to admit what's grown here." Clara's lips parted, her heart pounding. "What has grown, Thomas?" He turned to her then, his eyes steady, filled with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "Hope, admiration, and something more. Something I thought I'd buried with my wife." Her hand tightened around the railing as tears stung her eyes. For so long she had believed herself unwanted, cast aside, a woman with no true place in the world. But in that moment, under the starlit sky, Thomas's words reached the deepest part of her. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but the distance between them had changed. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were two hearts cautiously, beautifully, learning to trust again. And as Clara returned to her room that night, she allowed herself, for the first time, to dream not of survival, but of love. The days after Thomas's quiet confession on the porch carried a different air in the household. Though no grand declarations had yet been made, Clara felt the shift in every glance, every word, every unspoken moment between them. There was no longer that wall of coldness in his eyes. Instead, there lingered a softness, hesitant but real. Emily noticed it too. The little girl clung to Clara with even more affection, not with fear this time, but with joy. She braided Clara's hair in the mornings, followed her while she milked the cow, and proudly announced to anyone who would listen in town, "This is Miss Clara. She's my mama now." Each time Emily said it, Clara's heart swelled and broke all at once. Swelled because the child's love was pure and certain. Broke because Clara still feared it wasn't hers, to keep, not unless Thomas truly chose her. One evening, Thomas asked Clara to walk with him along the edge of the pasture. The golden light of sunset painted the sky, and the cool air carried the scent of fresh grass. Clara walked beside him, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "You've made this house a home again," Thomas began, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly." Clara shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. Emily needed love. And she hesitated, her voice catching. "I needed a place to belong." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "And do you feel you've found that here?" Her throat tightened. "Sometimes I dare to hope, but I know I came as an arrangement, not as someone you chose freely." That thought still weighs heavy. Thomas's brow furrowed, and for a moment, silence hung between them. Then he stepped closer, his voice low and earnest. "Clara, I may not have known what I was asking for when I wrote that letter, but now I do. You are no arrangement. You are no burden. You are the heart, this ranch, and Emily, and I have been missing." Her breath hitched, tears rising in her eyes. "Thomas." He reached for her hand, rough and calloused, yet holding hers as though it were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. "I don't want you to stay because of duty. I don't want you to stay because a letter brought you here. I want you to stay because you choose us. Because you choose me." Her tears spilled then, falling freely as relief and joy surged within her. "I do choose you, Thomas. I've chosen you from the moment Emily asked me to be her mama." At that moment, a small voice called out from behind them. "Papa? Miss Clara?" Emily came running, her hair flying, her face flushed with excitement. She grabbed Clara's skirt and looked up at her father with pleading eyes. "Papa, can she really be my mama, please?" Thomas knelt down, pulling his daughter into his arms. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "Clara already is your mama in every way that matters. But if she have us, she'll be our family forever." Emily squealed with delight, hugging Clara tightly. Clara knelt too, wrapping the girl in her arms as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had never known a love so pure, so certain. That night, Thomas and Clara stood together on the porch once more, the stars shining bright above them. He looked at her with steady eyes, no hesitation left in his voice. "Clara," he said, "I don't offer grand speeches. I don't have fine words, but I know my heart, and it belongs with you. Will you be my wife, not in name only, but in truth, in love, in forever?" Her heart swelled with an answer she had long carried. "Yes, Thomas, 1,000 times, yes." He leaned forward then, and for the first time, their lips met in a gentle, trembling kiss. It wasn't born of desperation, but of promise. Steady and certain. Emily, peeking from the doorway with a grin, clapped her hands and whispered to herself, "I have a mama now." From that day onward, the ranch no longer felt like a place of grief. It became a place of hope, of laughter, of second chances. Clara, once a mail-order bride who believed herself unwanted, had found not only a husband and daughter but a home, built on love freely chosen. And as she tucked Emily into bed that night, Clara whispered a promise to herself. She would never again doubt her worth. For she was wanted, she was chosen, she was forever.